Well, I've got the last few minutes here before we go off to our big meeting, and I wanted to just give you a short climate update, a look back at last year, and look forward in time for this coming year. I should mention on here that most of the state's in pretty good shape. There's just a little area in yellow there with abnormally dry conditions. We're actually in pretty good shape this year going into the growing season. 2014, the bigger map here shows the departure from normal temperature for the year as a whole. And you can see most of the southeast is in green, so it's a little bit below normal, a little cool year. But if you look at the small inset map, we're actually pretty good compared to a lot of the country. Up in the upper Midwest where I'm from, there's a lot of blues there. It was very cold in 2014. And if you're in California and places out in the west, it was very hot. Of course, that's associated with the drought that they've been in for the last several years. So we were pretty cool, but not terribly cool. If you break it down by months, you can see the first part of the year for Georgia was pretty cool, and the end of the year was quite variable, November being cold and December being really warm. One of the things that's really interesting to me is if you can see just in the central part of the year, this we're making, but the same pattern is true across the state. The green shows the normal temperatures, and then the reds and the blues are the extremes. This whole period, really from May to almost September, we were almost exactly normal. Now that's a really weird situation. Usually you have a lot more fluctuation in temperature during the growing season. There were a couple of cold outbreaks in November. You can remember there were a couple times in July it felt more like October for a few days. But other than that, really it was a very normal year, at least during the growing season as far as temperature goes. For precipitation, this is one of those free products from the National Weather Service that shows the radar estimates of precipitation. The blues are inches above normal, the reds and yellows are below normal. You can see that in Georgia, really the southern half of the state for the year as a whole was fairly wet, and the northern half was fairly dry. There's this big hole here in east central Alabama. I'm not quite sure. I guess they just got missed by a lot. And then there's a string along the southern border here where it's really wet. But if you look at how it breaks down by month, you know, it's a little deceptive because there was a lot of variation from one month to another. Early in the season, it was fairly dry, and then we hit April. April was incredibly wet, and a lot of people, if you're going out to plant cotton end of April into May, then you had problems getting into the fields in some cases. It was a real issue. Then we went through most of the summer, and it was dry. And we developed drought in a lot of Georgia and a lot of the southeast because of that. That really didn't change until September and the end of the month. So that caused a lot of problems for farmers. Not just cotton farmers, but a lot of the other farmers across the state, too. Because that distribution, even though the year as a whole was close to average, the seasonal distribution really affects things a lot more. Because of the dry conditions in the growing season, in the middle of the year, we developed drought in parts of the state. This is the picture of the maximum extent of drought conditions, which was on September 2, which corresponds, I think, to the water stress that was talked about in the previous. Yellow here is just abnormally dry, and then as we get into the tans and the darker tans, that becomes severe drought. After the beginning of September, we started to pick up on some of the rainfall. I think there were several reasons for why it was so dry this year. One was that we didn't have any tropical storms that really affected our area at all. Tropical storms give up to 30% of our rainfall during the tropical season. So if you don't have them, you're very likely to go into a drought. Another thing is that we had sort of like El Nino conditions in the eastern Pacific Ocean. We never quite got to that level of calling it officially an El Nino, but that can also lead to drought. And we had this sort of seesaw in pressure. There was high pressure on the west coast that contributed to the drought in California, and we had really persistent low pressure here on the east coast. In fact, the east coast of the U.S. was one of the only places in the world where we had temperatures below normal for the year because of that long wave pattern. We just look at temperature trends over time. This is from 1895. And this is annual average temperature. Here's 2014. You can see 2014, compared to the really long record, it was just a little cooler than average. But compared to the trend we've had going since about 1970, it was really on the cool end. So I think it's likely we're not going to see another cool year just because we're having that upward trend and we're already sort of on the cool side of that. And so likely we're going to have warmer conditions this year going ahead. Precipitation, there are really no long-term trends in Georgia. You can see 2013 here. Wes was talking about that. We're not going to see 2013-like rainfalls very often. So most years you're going to want to irrigate. You're not going to be able to count on enough water from the rain fed. But there's still a lot of year-to-year variation. We may go into another dry year this year. We're going to kind of wait and see. El Nino outlook, many of you know that El Nino can affect the weather conditions here in the southeast. We've been sort of like an El Nino, not quite at that level, so it's been real weak this year. They're not, at this point, they don't know if one's even going to develop because we're getting pretty late in the winter for that to happen. So most likely we'll continue to be in neutral conditions. Neutral conditions is not all bad for cotton. And I should mention also, so far this year we're warmer and drier than normal. Of course, we're not even 1 month into the year yet, so it's a little early to say what's going to happen. I'll talk about El Nino and its impact on cotton yields in just a minute. Let me talk about the outlook. Since we don't know what's happening with El Nino, we really have to say there's not a lot of predictability there. That means you're going to probably want to use regular climatology when you make decisions about planting dates and things like that, because we don't really have a strong signal it's going to be cool or warm. And so this is true for February and April. It's also true as you go farther out. This is May through July. You can see large parts of the country will probably be above normal in temperature. We don't really have a strong signal here. So again, climatology is the way to go. And if you look out any farther, it's really hard to say. There's a hint maybe next winter we might go into a La Nina, which would mean a dry winter next year. But that's a long ways down the pike. We look at cotton yields in neutral years, and this is from agroclimate.org, so you can actually go into agroclimate.org and play around with the effects of what happens to cotton yields when you have an El Nino year versus a La Nina. I just did the statistics here for Tift County. You can see in an El Nino year, we tend to have higher cotton yields. In a La Nina year, we tend to have lower yields. That's related a lot to the amount of precipitation that occurs. You can kind of pick out your own county. Anything that's close, that's yellow, is pretty close to normal. The reds are lower than usual cotton yields. It's hard to see on this projector here, but there are some areas that are a little bit greener. You can look at the website and see the greener areas. Those are areas with increased cotton yield. So actually we're not looking bad for this year. I think the chances of having a really bad cotton yield are probably not real high. So the bottom line, I think, going into this growing season is that soil moistures look pretty good. You know, we have just that little area of abnormally dry conditions. I think over the next month or so that's probably going to be erased. I think temperatures are probably going to be fairly cool at the beginning of the season. We've been in the seesaw of temperatures this year. There's been a lot of ups and downs. I think for people that are growing vegetables, this is probably a little more important, or fruits. There's a good likelihood that we're going to see a late frost this year. So when I talk to gardeners, I say, don't be too early to put stuff out, because it's probably going to get nipped. When we have this high variability of weather, then you tend to see later frosts, which is a real problem if you're a fruit farmer, for example, and you're worried about a warm spell, the trees all blooming, and then having the frost come and kill it off. One thing I think is going to be really important is that I think we're likely to see an increase in tropical storms this year. Now, that's partly related to the neutral conditions. We tend to have more tropical storms in neutral conditions. And we've been missing for the last several years, so sort of just going on that basis, you say, well, we're more likely. Tropical storms, tropical season goes from June 1st until the end of November, and so we're probably going to see some rain. Early tropical storms tend to come from the Gulf, and they're more likely to affect Georgia. Later tropical storms come from Africa. They're more likely to affect places like Texas and Louisiana. So I think we're likely seeing more rain, especially later in the season because of those tropical storms. Of course, we cannot predict any particular storm and where it's going to go. That depends on the conditions in the atmosphere at the time. So I'm going to stop there. That was pretty fast. If you're more interested in information, GeorgiaClimate.com is my new website. It's got links to some of these sources of information. I do have a blog as well where I talk about different aspects of climate and agriculture in the Southeast. If you're interested in looking at that cotton yield map, it's agroclimate.org. And all of those are really good sources for information going on into the future and looking for these different sources of information on weather. So I've got time for a couple questions or comments if you've got comments about the weather that affected you this past year.
You say you're not expecting an El Nino?
No, I think El Nino at this point, even if it would happen, it's so late in the year that I just don't think it's going to be very strong. And so I think we're going to go back. We'll probably be in neutral. Most likely we'll be in neutral conditions until at least August. Usually August is the point where you can start to tell what's going to happen for the next winter. So at this point I don't think El Nino is too likely. Any other comments or questions? Okay, everybody's got this look in their eyes like they want to get some coffee. So go on if you want to find me. I don't have a speaker tag, but I'm probably the only person wearing red stripes here today, so you can come and find me if you need.